Great.
Yes, we are.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for your invitation, Shoba, and um, aloha mai kako. I guess I can introduce myself in Hawaiian. I'm Thomas Kettig. Thank you again for having me here with the ILA. Before I begin, also I'll just mention I am from New York City, and the ILA has a small part to play in me being a linguist. I was interested in linguistics in high school, and I do remember so when I was 16, this is 2008, I did go to an ILA, one of these Saturday ILA talks in person. I thought it was going to be on the city college campus, but it turned out to be in the community room of a public housing complex in Harlem, and it was very exciting and very interesting. And so it's sort of fun to go full circle that I'm now presenting at this the International Linguistics Association, where in high school I was attending your lectures. So thank you very much for this invitation. Today I'll be talking about Hawaiian, and this is the outline of the presentation. I'll be starting with a little brief history of Hawaii and Hawaiian, then talking about the different types of speakers that you find of Hawaiian today, and then I'll talk a little bit about some various topics in Hawaiian phonology. My own research is mostly in Hawaiian vowels and acoustic detail in Hawaiian vowels, but I'll also touch on some interesting consonant stuff. And at the end, I'll wrap it up with talking about some future and current directions of ongoing research, as well as some thoughts I have about engagement with the community. So here we are in Hawaii. So I'm physically located in Canada right now, but these snowy days, I sort of wish I was in the Pacific. So Hawaii is in the center of the North Pacific, and here you can see it in the context of the rest of Oceania. And of course, here you can see Hawaii colored as it is currently under U.S. occupation. These are the main inhabited islands of Hawaii. There are several atolls that exist in the northwest that are uninhabited. But starting here in the southeast, we have the Big Island of Hawaii. This is where Kilauea volcano is located. It's the most volcanically active and, of course, the largest island. We call it the Big Island. And the name of the island, Hawaii, lends the rest of the island chain its current name. Then going north of there, we have Maui. This is a view of Haleakala, the volcano that makes up the majority of Maui from western Maui. If we look across the channel there from Lahaina, which unfortunately was destroyed by fire about a year ago, we see on the right Molokai. So this island here is Molokai. On the left here is Lanai. Another view from Maui. These are all photos I've taken of Hawaii. You can see Kaho'olawe, which is this small island. It's uninhabited. It was used for ordnance, U.S. ordnance training purposes for many decades, and so it is uninhabited and uninhabitable because of all of the unexploded bombs that are located on it still. And then that brings us to the most populous island of Oahu. This is a view of the west part of the island, and this is a valley in the east of the island in Honolulu, this valley called Palolo, where I lived for 5 years while doing my graduate studies. And then we'll end up here at the northwest corner of the island chain in Kauai, a very verdant island. I don't have any pictures of Ni'ihau, which actually one cannot visit. It is not open for public visits, and it is owned privately by a single family and has a very interesting, very isolated population that I'll talk in more detail about in this presentation. That's a little bit of a overview to show you where we are. And this is me taking a hike in Kauai in this beautiful cliffside hike on the north face of Hawaii. So now about the language spoken in Hawaii. So Ōlelo Hawaiʻi, or the Hawaiian language, is a Polynesian language that's in the Austronesian language family. If you have any questions about how humans ended up there, feel free to ask in the question period. It seems from the archaeological evidence like humans settled in Hawaii by about 1000 AD. It's unclear whether it's plus or minus 100 or so years. And after settlement of Hawaii, contact was maintained pretty regularly for several hundred years between Hawaii and places like Tahiti, the Marquesas Islands, Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and even Aotearoa, New Zealand, given their ocean-going technology. But in the late 1770s, European contact began. Captain Cook and Captain Vancouver were doing their explorations and were able to contact Hawaii, which was dubbed the Sandwich Islands. And at that point, the this ali'i, so this noble from the big island of Hawaii named Kamehameha, was undertaking a war of conquest and unifying the island chain. He took full advantage of the new technologies that were offered by the European explorers and quickly finished up his unification campaign with the aid of things like cannons. And he not only was fully immersed in the technological innovations of weaponry that the Europeans provided, but also was very excited about the new communication technology introduced of writing. And this is Kamehameha's signature here from one of the first treaties ever signed between him as the king of the Sandwich Islands here and European powers. You can see that at that point, the K was written as a T, and I'll be coming back to this later on. So this is Kamehameha's own signature there. This interest in literacy continued, and so in the 1820s, when missionaries started coming to Christianize the population, they developed an alphabet for Bible translation, and the ruling kings and nobles embraced this very wholeheartedly. They proclaimed that this nation would be a nation of literacy, and within the next couple of decades, Hawaii had the highest literacy rate in the world. There was near universal literacy in Hawaiian by the 1840s, and that was helped along by a huge number of newspapers that popped up starting in the 1830s. People in Hawaii were aware that their oral histories and their mythologies were in danger of being forgotten. They were acutely aware of this because there was massive population collapse due to introduced diseases. And so they very quickly wrote down pretty much everything they remembered from the pre-contact times. And so we have a wonderful, huge archive of newspapers, of written sources in Hawaiian, which is quite unique in the sort of global indigenous language revitalization situation of having, in this case, over 1 million pages of text that were published over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And this includes things like not just the oral histories, but also legal debate, local news, translations of classic literature in serial format, so like 1001 Nights, Charles Dickens. All of this was translated into Hawaiian and put into the newspapers, along with scientific information. So it gave people their first glimpse at a polar bear, at an elephant, at a giraffe, at a reindeer, all these exotic animals that nobody had seen before. All of this was available to for public consumption in the newspapers. By the end of the 19th century, the native Hawaiian population had completely collapsed, and very few remained compared to the previous population. And most of the population had been replaced by immigrant laborers from Asia. So people from Okinawa in particular, Korea, the Philippines, also some from Portugal because of sugar farming, and the ruling classes, which at this point by the late 19th century were mainly Americans who were descended from the missionary families, then owned most of the land and overthrew the last queen, Liliuokalani here, in a coup, supported later on by the American government. William McKinley in 1898 looked favorably upon a unilateral annexation. And so Hawaii was annexed to the US with no international treaty. From that point on, Hawaiian declined precipitously. So even though over the course of the 19th century, Hawaiian had continued to be the lingua franca, the business language of the islands, starting in the 1890s, Hawaiian was outlawed as a medium of education, and this law was not reversed until 1986. Hawaiian was only spoken by as few as 50 children by the 1980s, and instead English became the language of commerce, and the main lingua franca in the islands was Hawaii Creole English, known as Pidgin. This sort of decline of Hawaiian continued into the 1970s when a cultural renaissance began, particularly spurred by the revitalization of traditional navigation techniques for ocean-going technology and this revitalization of interest in Hawaiian music and dance, so hula. And as part of this, there was a language revitalization program spearheaded by Larry Kimura, who's this man here on the right. In 1972, he established a radio program called Ka Leo Hawaiʻi, or The Sound of Hawaiian. And I'll be discussing this radio program in depth in a little bit. But this brought all different types of native speakers from all across the island chain to a studio in Honolulu, where we now have recordings of all of these sessions, basically sociolinguistic interviews with hundreds of native speakers at that time. Larry also founded the Punana Leo, so the language nests, to link children with elders so that we could sort of skip this middle generation of people who didn't speak Hawaiian and start to get children directly involved in the revitalization. So that started in 1982, 4 years before the law against Hawaiian medium education was lifted. So this was an illegal revitalization for several years. On the left here, we see Auntie Lolena. This is Lolena Nicholas. She's from the island of Ni'ihau. And again, I'll be describing Ni'ihau Hawaiian in a little bit of detail here in this presentation. So on to our sort of more linguistics-oriented part of the discussion. I'll be first going over what types of speakers are there of Hawaiian. And this is important because as linguists, when we describe, let's say, the phonetics of a language or the phonology of a language, often we just say, this is Hawaiian phonetics and Hawaiian phonology. In this community, there's a huge amount of diversity in terms of language dominance as well as various dialectal differences. So I find it very important to first go over sort of who are we describing when we describe Hawaiian sounds. So this is a little chart taken from a paper by Benzinger and Heinrich on who speaks Hawaiian, and I'll go through in a little detail each of these different groups. So first, we have the people whose families are located on the island of Ni'ihau. This island, again, off the coast of Kauai, is extremely isolated. There's only about 50 to 150 people that live on this island year-round. The community in Ni'ihau is very close-knit. They are fundamentalist Calvinists, so very religious Christians. And this isolation of the island, it's been privately owned since the 1830s, has prevented English transfer on this island. So this is the only place in Hawaii where there has been completely unbroken transmission from L1 to L1 and childhood acquisition in most or all domains of use. At this point, because there are no government services on Ni'ihau, there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's no hospitals, for instance. Most family members of these families live on the island of Kauai. And so because of increasing amount of contact with English in order to get government services like health services and schooling, transmission of this dialect may start to be threatened. But for the most part, still, it's pretty good. We still have pretty good intergenerational transfer here. This other group of what we call old native speakers, traditional speakers, old native speakers, there's lots of different words for this group, are the other L1 speakers of Hawaiian who have also learned it as an L1 from L1s. And in childhood with lots of domains, there are less than 30 of these people alive. So outside of the island of Ni'ihau and those families, very, very few people remain on any of the other islands whose Hawaiian was acquired from other L1 speakers. But we do have extensive audio and video archives of these speakers. Then we have a group of pioneers, so the people who founded the revitalization movement in the 70s at universities on the Big Island, so at Hilo, and on Oahu at University of Hawaii Manoa. And these speakers consider themselves, for the most part, L2 speakers, and they acquired the language in limited domains, but from Old Native speakers and from Ni'ihau speakers to begin the revitalization of the language. They were then able to teach, and their descendants, these L2 learners then became teachers of other L2 learners. And so we now have several thousand, probably more than what Brenzinger and Heinrich have here is 7,000, probably more like 10,000 L2 highly proficient speakers who gained the language in university classrooms. And then we have the children of the pioneers and the children of these new L2 speakers who are acquiring and have been for the last couple decades acquiring Hawaiian as a first language alongside English and Hawaii Creole English. And for these speakers, school is the primary domain of use and acquisition. Some families have sort of family-based Hawaiian usage in their households. A lot of times they don't. It's sort of unclear to what extent speakers in this group are using Hawaiian in what domains. So even though they may consider themselves L1 speakers, there may be very, very limited domains of use as Hawaiian is not able to be used. There's so few speakers that you cannot use it in commercial settings, for instance, in Hawaii. And so the estimate here of 300 is probably several times that now. There are definitely several thousand people who've gone through Hawaiian immersion schooling since the 80s and 90s. But there's a question about to what extent do people maintain the language outside of schooling situations, even if it is one of their L1s. In the future, there will, of course, be more speakers of Hawaiian, but there, again, is a big question about whether domains of use will expand. I'm not holding my breath. The state of Hawaii does not seem to be interested at all in supporting this revitalization in ways that linguists know will actually revitalize a language. So the expansion of domains has not really been seen in the last few decades, and so it's unclear whether that will happen. But in any case, less and less contact will be available with the old native speakers, and so it's potentially the case that the language changes that are going to progress will increasingly be due to and sort of pushing along changes that come from intensive contact with English. But one thing that I'd like to also note here is that even though there are less than 30 Old Native speakers still alive outside of this isolated Ni'ihau community, we have hundreds of hours of archival recordings that are used in classrooms for imitation exercises and memorization exercises. And the reason that these are used so much in classrooms is because this type of Hawaiian, the traditional forms of Hawaiian spoken by L1 speakers who acquired it as an L1 from L1s, this is very highly esteemed. This is seen in the community as the authentic Hawaiian, that Ni'ihau speakers and other Old Native speakers, these sort of top groups on this chart, are the authentic speakers. And so there's a sense of through which learners and even L1 speakers, who learn it in childhood today, have a sort of sense of, well, I don't speak the right Hawaiian, I don't speak real Hawaiian. If we want to improve our Hawaiian, we need to be looking to these archival recordings for help. So even though these varieties may no longer be spoken, they have very high cultural relevance for Native Hawaiians today. And that brings me to the Ka Leo Hawaiʻi radio program that I mentioned before. This is a young Larry Kimura here. You can see his face here. He began interviewing elders in the 1970s and catalyzed the revitalization of Hawaiian through this radio program that broadcast the voices of elderly native speakers. There's 625 hours on tape. They've all been digitized, have not all been transcribed. Transcription is a big hurdle here, but certainly enough transcription has been done by the Kani Aina project at University of Hawaii Hilo, as well as by people like myself doing some work on this so that we can now do some linguistic work on this archive and not only use this in sort of memorization exercises or imitation exercises in classrooms. The sample that I have so far that I built for my dissertation, and which I've continued to use and I'm starting to expand on, is these 8 speakers, so 8 interviews. These interviews went from about 60 to 90 minutes, so quite a bit of data. Depends on the person, though. Some of these speakers I have less data than for others. And this is a male and a female speaker, each from the 4 main islands of Kauai, Oahu, Maui, and Hawaii. And these were recorded in the early 1970s, so they represent Hawaiian of elderly speakers from the 1970s. So Hawaiian that was learned at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So it gives us a really nice sort of window into the past. Um, I've undertaken, all of the forced alignment necessary to get this, automatically measurable through various computer programs. So here's, for instance, a clip of a woman speaking Hawaiian here.
Kiroi no I kona halauma a kiroi kana line ho I mera me kai a e mamaki I ai e te poe.
Right, so hopefully you could hear that. And you can see here that what the forced alignment does is it takes all of the words and the phonemes within those words. Thankfully, Hawaiian has a very transparent orthography. So really all we need to do is align each letter with its phoneme, because it's a very nice and transparent there. And we can then do various types of automated extraction of acoustic measures. From this data. And for my dissertation, I think I collected about 60 or 80,000 tokens of vowels from these 8 speakers. So we have quite a bit of data to work with. Going on to sort of the phonological stuff that might be of interest to some people here. So why is Hawaiian interesting? Obviously, it's interesting for Hawaiians and people in the revitalization movement, but why is it interesting for phonologists and other linguists? Well, if you've taken a phonology class in the university, you may have come across some sort of problem set involving Hawaiian, because it is known for having an extremely low number of consonant phonemes. It's typically described as lacking a T, which is cross-linguistically very uncommon. T is one of these sounds we sort of assume that every language is at least one type of T, and it's very rare to find a language that has no T. So that's why Hawaiian sort of captures people's imagination. And also, in addition to having very few consonants, it has a very limited, very restrictive syllable structure where there's an optional onset of a single consonant, no codas, and you end up getting lots of strings of adjacent vowels. Some of these vowels may be syllabified together into the same syllable. Others may be across syllable boundaries, but it's a very vowel-rich language. So for a vowel nerd like me, it's a great place for doing some research. And I'll start off my discussion of Hawaiian phonetics and phonology with reference to a paper by Ōiwi Parker Jones. This is him at Wright. And a little bit of background about Ōiwi. He is a neurolinguist at Oxford. So this is him wearing his little cap to do his neurolinguistics research. But he also was part of the very first class of Punana Leo graduates. So in 1982, he was a small child and was put into Hawaiian immersion. And he went from preschool all the way through high school in Hawaiian alone. And so he was part of that very first class, the sort of experimental class of basically attempting to revitalize Hawaiian from the ground up, as a child. So he's a really interesting sort of success story from this movement, where now they have this Oxford neurolinguist who did all of his education in Hawaiian, right? So it's actually great to see how successful he's been. But in any case, so back to his 2018 paper, he gave this sort of very basic description of Hawaiian phonetics and phonology based on his friend Ōlelo Wilson in the same class, so same, early, so the children of these early pioneers who grew up speaking Hawaiian as one of their L1s, and mainly acquiring it in school, as well as through L2 parents. And so this description of Hawaiian speech is based on very little data, so just 2 minutes of data, but it provides us a really nice sort of scaffolding for other research that can be done on Hawaiian, in particular phonetic detail that we can sort of compare against his sort of his basic outline here, as well as other dialectal differences that we might find that might be different from the sort of standard revitalized Hawaiian. So starting with his consonants, here's the consonant inventory of Hawaiian. It is sparse. As a linguist, you're used to seeing these consonant inventories, and particularly with, um, the native languages, for instance, here in Canada, you'll see like dozens and dozens of consonants in some cases. Or with African languages, you have dozens and dozens of consonants. Not the case in Hawaii. We have an M and a P, which are, as far as I know, don't have too much allophonic stuff going on. We have what Oiwi writes as a V. This is spelled as a W. In Oiwi's dialect, so revitalized, standardized, Big Island Hawaiian spoken by new speakers, this is almost always a V sound. So he does write it as a V on this consonant chart. Other dialects of Hawaiian pronounce it as a W. There is some allophonic variation there. But anyway, this is this WV consonant that has some alternation. Then we have these two alveolars, N and L, and then we have a velar K, and a glottal stop and an H. And so because of the lack of consonants and the extremely limited options for syllabification, the glottal stop and the H actually have quite a high functional load in this language. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff about voice quality, so glottalization and breathiness that I'd like to look at in the future in this language. But one thing that I'd like to sort of call attention to is the K. So here's just a little clip of a newspaper from the early 19th century, the early 20th century. And we can see here that there are lots and lots of Ks, no Ts. We see here, this is a more modern Hawaiian orthography that includes markers for long vowels, as well as an okina for the glottal stop. What looks like a glottal stop in some of the older orthography is not actually a glottal stop. You can ask me about that later if you're interested, but they did not used to write glottal stops or long vowels. Whereas now in the modern orthography we do. But in any case, you see lots and lots of Ks, but otherwise no Ts in this language, right? So one thing that I'd like to call your attention to, though, is when we actually listen to Hawaiian, what do we hear, right? Especially when we listen to people who are speaking dialects other than the standard revitalized dialect. So this is a clip that I'll play for you and listen to her pronunciations.
Ine ua ʻōlelo ia ane ane mate ta ʻōlelo a ka mani I hau a ale no pela dumea mani I hau mauno ta ʻōlelo mai to wā mai to mātu po e tūpuna to laku po e tūpuna a to mātu mau mātua a leila hiti mai a mātou.
So as you might have heard, I can even raise this volume. I don't know if it was good volume for you guys, but she has T's, and in particular the word kupuna, which is she pronounces as tupuna. She has T's in her language, right? So it's not necessarily the case that Hawaiian lacks a T. It just depends on whose dialect you're describing, right? So I'll play this once again, and this woman is Ku'uipolani Wong. She's from Ni'iho, and I'll be discussing some of her work actually in the next few slides. So let's listen to her once again.
Ine ua ʻōlelo ia ane ane mate ta ʻōlelo a ka mani I hau a ale no pela dumea mani I hau mauno ta ʻōlelo mai to wā mai to mātu po e tūpuna to laku po e tūpuna a to mātu mau mātua a leila hiti mai a mātou.
Right, so you can hear lots of her T's there. And she got a PhD from University of Hawaii. She's not a linguist, but she got her PhD in Hawaiian studies, and her dissertation has been published as this book, which is a collection of stories from and about Ni'iho. It is written in Ni'iho Hawaiian. Ni'ihoans do not use the markers for glottal stop or for long vowels either. So it's a little bit difficult to read if you're used to reading standard Hawaiian. It's sort of like trying to ride a bike with your training wheels off, right? Because you lose an entire half of the vowels and an entire consonant phoneme in the orthography. But it's really fascinating to read, and her chapter 3 contains some really cool insider reflections on Ni'iho language practices that, even though she's not a linguist herself, can give us linguists some insight into this. And so she has a whole section where she has these tables that list on the right the pronunciation and writing that would be in standard Hawaiian, and on the left, how those words would be pronounced in Niihau. And so we can see that there's lots of T's that emerge in this language, in Niihau Hawaiian, in this dialect. And we can actually assume that T is the underlying form for these speakers. T is the proto-form. T is the form that you see in Tahitian and Marquesan and Maori. So T is clearly the underlying form, the original form of this in Hawaiian, and still is for the Niihauans. But the T is becomes a K, so this underlying T shifts to a velar place of articulation in avoidance of having two or more T's within the same word. It also seems like maybe there's some foot stuff going on. It seems like maybe it's sort of there's whenever you think that you've figured out the pattern, some sort of exception seems to arise, but either in the word boundary or within a foot, it seems like there's avoidance of having two T's in a row. And so you have words like koko, which means blood, becomes koto. Or words like kako, which means all of us, like this more three or more inclusive pronoun, is kato in Niihau Hawaiian. So you have this avoidance of having the identical consonant twice. Here in kikiki, which is a ticket, you end up having kikiti, so that you avoid having three T's in a row. It comes KKT. But what's also really interesting, that's something that she notices and puts in her tables, is that this also applies to N. So in standard Hawaiian, you have words like iniki and noke, and in Niihau, rather than having initi and toke, you have iniki and noke, just like in standard Hawaiian, again, to avoid the presence of multiple alveolars in the words. So it seems like this is a dissimilation process where some sort of consonant disharmony is happening, where, even though, again, T is the underlying form, in Niihau Hawaiian, the presence of an alveolar N encourages this T to become a K. This also applies for L. So the presence of an L in the same word or in the same foot also encourages this T to become K. So in like leka, which is letter, the English word letter, but the T becomes a K. We see that in Niihau also this T leta becomes a K leka in order to avoid this harmony of alveolars. Here's some more examples here of longer words like three or more syllables where L's and N's cause the T to become K also. One thing really fascinating here that I would love to do more research on in the future is that there seems to be an emergence of minimal pairs where T and K are actually sort of becoming separate phonemes in this dialect. And this is because, first of all, Hawaiian, with its very limited inventory of phonemes and very limited ability to create syllables, has an enormous amount of homophony. This is a language that is built on homophony. Every possible word form that you encounter has like 8 different meanings because they just don't have many options for making two-syllable words in the language, right? And so you end up with these homophones like kula and kula, which one means school and one means plain. And in Niihau, it seems like they have started to specialize meaning, one kula meaning school and the other kula meaning plain as tula. This other one, kali, is particularly interesting. Kali means both to wait and vagina. And in Niihau Hawaiian, as an insular community of very fundamentalist Christians, it's very useful to have some taboo avoidance, right? So to avoid the uttering this sort of more taboo term of vagina, but in order to use a very common verb to wait, they've actually distinguished between the two. One is kali and one is tali. So there's some interesting stuff going on here with perhaps emergent phonemicization of a KT distinction, even though for the most part these really are one phoneme in most of the language. I'll just end here about the TK allophony. This isn't the focus of most of my research. I'm more of a vowel guy, but something I noticed during my over the course of my dissertation and doing analysis is that this doesn't only exist in Niihau. There are dialects from East Maui in particular, where T also remains in several instances. So here's an example of that.
Mei te ika i o kera ano karo pi no mākou.
Right, so here you can hear alternation between T's and K's. This word kalo is, of course, the word taro, which is the main staple crop of Hawaii. K's, T's become K's and R's become L's, so we get the word taro. And kalo, they are cognate. So this is about him talking about how good this particular variety of taro is that he used to eat. Again, it isn't just Niihau that at least used to have T and TK allophony. These dialects are now extinct. There are no speakers of these East Maui T dialects, but the speech remains in our archives. So it'll be really interesting to look at going forward. Now I'll turn to the vowel system, which is the focus of my main research. And here we see O.E.V. Parker-Jones's description of the vowels. We see a nice symmetrical 5-vowel system, I, E, A, O, U, with long vowels and short vowels. And then we also see this really nice exhaustive list of the diphthongs of the language. One thing that I would mention here is that these diphthongs are not unitary phonemes. So unlike in English, where I and ow and a are pretty much unitary phonemes that you can't like break them up into an a-u. It's not like there's like 2 vowel phonemes there in English. In Hawaiian, it does seem, for various reasons that I can go into later if you have questions about it, there's various reasons to believe that these are clusters of separate phonemes that just get combined into the same nucleus of a syllable. One thing that sort of caught my eye here, or caught my ear when I was first learning Hawaiian, when I was learning Hawaiian in Hawaii, is the distinction among these different diphthongs that, at least to me, having done my undergrad in Canada and now living in Canada, sound very much like Canadian raising to me, right? So there seems to be some sort of co-articulation where the ai diphthong becomes ai, and the ae remains as I, and the au becomes au, and the ao is ao. And so you have this raising of the before high vowels in these diphthongs. So I'll play a couple of examples here. So first, ai versus I.
Hane, hane, like.
So we have ai and I, and then we have o and ao.
Fo, ow, 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 ow.
Right, so we have both the and the following vowel being different in all of these. We also have this very similar bunch of diphthongs, these long diphthongs in words like aina and laua.
Aina, laua, laua.
And so this made me start thinking, well, in classrooms, so when I was learning Hawaiian, I was learning in a university classroom. It's very difficult for English speakers to perceive or produce these distinctions. I was sort of at an advantage in one way because I had some Canadian raising already, so I could distinguish between ai and I and between au and ao. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out whether any of those were different from the ai and the au in these long diphthongs. So starting with my dissertation, I was sort of thinking, okay, well, this is an interesting description and sort of just general overview of how the vowel system should work. What do we actually see when we listen to older native speakers and see how they implement these vowels? So here, right? So when we look in the Ka Leo Hawaiʻi recordings of these old native speakers, what are their vowel systems and what sort of variation might we observe? So I'll start off by just giving us a little tour of the monophthongs here. This is all 8 of my speakers normalized and put on a vowel chart. And we can see here, first of all, interesting cross-linguistically common thing is that the long vowels in each of these pairs each of these long vowels is more peripheral than its short counterpart. Unsurprising, it takes longer for the tongue to get to its more extreme target. And so when you have more time to get there, the tongue is able to get to the target. So in each of these pairs, the the longer vowel is more extreme and more peripheral. An interesting thing that had not been noted before in Hawaiian is that the a pair seems to be quite differentiated by a length in not just its length, but also its quality. And I'm not sure exactly why this happens. If we look at our number of tokens, we see that we have many fewer tokens for long A than we do for the other vowel classes. So that may be just something we need more data before we can really answer why is it that long A seems to be halfway between short E and long E. Sort of a little bit of a mystery there still. But going to the diphthongs, which is sort of the, again, where I was interested in going for these sort of comparative purposes, I'll play these again for you.
Honey, like
So A and I, and then we have,
oh, oh.
so we have O and Ao. So when we look at the speech of these 8 Old Native speakers, we do indeed see that our A does what Parker Jones said it should. It starts right around where the monophthong A is, and this pink line here, this trajectory, it ends right around where E is. So perfect. Our A is behaving as expected. Our AO doesn't get as far as the O necessarily, but it does start pretty low down near where the A monophthong is, and it goes up toward O. And then, just as we expected, we do have some co-articulatory effects where there is a height difference with the beginning of this I vowel. So we start at and we go to E, so that's our I. And then we have O, which does end at U, and it begins nice and centralized at this sound. And again, something interesting to note is that even though descriptions of Hawaiian sort of describe this as having 2 different starting places, so an F1 or a height difference in co-articulation, we also see F2 differences. So there are actually 4 different locations where these 4 diphthongs begin, not just 2. So even though we only perceive the difference in the height, there is some co-articulation in terms of frontness and backness going on also. So I thought that was a very interesting finding, and but overall pretty much expected. Now the question is, what do we do with these longer vowels, these longer diphthongs?
I know. Lower.
Right, so where do those fit in to this vowel, this diphthong system? So here are these diphthongs again. In color, we have I, O, and I, Ao. And in gray, we have I. So here we start nice and low, right? Even lower, in fact, than where the long A is on its own. And we finish very close to the E. So this is a really nice full diphthong. And we see that it is different overall. If we look sort of at our speakers' overall data, we have a 3-way distinction between I, and I, right? So this is quite a difficult distinction to perceive or to make, but it seems to be there overall in these speakers. And it behaves as we expect from Oivi's description. What is not behaving as expected is this ao. Why is it that we expect the ao to begin nice and low like ai, but instead it is raised. It begins nice and centralized. And so we're like, well, why would this be? It took me a while to figure out why, but I started looking at my token counts. I realized I had very few tokens of ao. And so I started just looking at the words that I was measuring for both of these classes. And for the I class, I was measuring words that all of the I words in my corpus have this aina root. So the word for land, aina. The word for kamaaina, if you've ever been to Hawaii, it means a local. So you often see kamaaina discounts at stores there. So to be familiar, to be local to a place, child of the land is literally. Ho'okaima'aina, to become acquainted. Kia'aina, a governor. Maka'ainana, a commoner. These are all aina-based words. The small number of tokens I have of ao, and I can discuss later in the questions if you're wondering why I had so few tokens of this, are these pronouns kao and nao. And I realized that this is a difference in content word versus function words. And so it occurred to me, maybe what we're seeing here is that maybe underlyingly, we should have what Oivi describes as like an au that begins nice and low and goes to u. But in this data set, and possibly in the language as a whole, there just aren't any content words with this diphthong in it. And what we're seeing here instead is the reduction of function words, which has been noted cross-linguistically, not really in the Austronesian language family before, but in better studied languages like English, Japanese, many European language, Indo-European languages in particular. This has been studied. We find that function words are shorter and more reduced than content words. So because I can't actually look at this within I or within au, I wanted to look at other diphthongs where we might actually be able to see this difference. And indeed, for I and O, and for A and O, we have both content and function words. So when we look at I, we find that the content words begin lower than the function words. We have centralization and shortening in terms of duration of these function words. And here in the the O, we also have longer trajectories and less centralized trajectories for the content words compared to the pronouns and the directionals. So function words that contain this vowel. For A and O, we also see that the non-content words, so the function words, are more monophthongal than the content words. So very interesting to see because this is a sort of cross-linguistically common, typologically common thing that just hasn't been tested on many smaller indigenous languages, but great to see that our theories about reduction and sort of and forms of speech that reduce, we were also seeing it arise here in our Hawaiian data. Again, coming back to the massive amount of homophony in Hawaiian, one of the nice things about Hawaiian is it gives us a really fun sort of natural experiment in lemma effects. So there are quite a few, as I explained before, most word forms have several different meanings associated with them. And so if we look at a word form like vai or wai, depending on your dialect, this means both who and water. And if we go through the whole Old Native Speaker, corpus and code for which words mean who and which vai mean who, which vai mean water, we see again here that the lemma with the content word meaning, the water meaning, has a fuller trajectory, less centralized, and the one meaning who, so the one that's a function word, is a more reduced trajectory. So future research on this can look into the extent to which this is an effect of prosodic, like the word who might just be in locations in a sentence that get reduced more or whatnot. But at least overall in the data, it does seem like what we're seeing is some interesting lemma effects in homophonous word forms. So something you might not be able to see as easily in Indo-European languages, but with Hawaiian, we get tons and tons of cool homophones. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's interspeaker variation. So as a sociolinguist, I'm also interested in how the speakers differ. We can see a speaker on the left who has almost no or basically no reduction of his non-content words, whereas a speaker on the right has a lot of reduction of these content words. So figuring out these non-content words. So being, if we look at this data with an eye toward interspeaker variation, we can start seeing, okay, maybe some of this is due to island-based regional differentiation, could be due to the fact that the person on the left is from Oahu, which had, even by the beginning of the 20th century, a much higher rate of bilingualism in English. Then on the right, this is our speaker from East Maui, very isolated part of the island chain. So there could be sort of parts of their sociolinguistic background that lead to these differences. And I know I'm running out of time here, so I'll finish up with some thoughts about ways to sort of make this interesting to the community from a pedagogical perspective. I've been developing a Shiny app in the R language to develop, basically to visualize vowel variation in groups of speakers as well as individuals. And my thought is that this could allow, if people are interested in it, right, in the community, could allow for more targeted engagement with the dialects of these old native speakers. So here you can see that I have these sort of toggles on the right where we can look at different types of words, different stresses of words, different types of vowels. what the sounds on either side of them are, which speakers we're looking at, whether to compare the speakers side by side. And for instance, here we can see that this speaker on the left has a full overlap, basically a complete merger of his I and his ai, and those are distinct from his raised ai, whereas this speaker on the right still has a full three-way distinction between ai, and ai, right? So there is going to be interspeaker variation in the usage of different vowel forms. This is going to be really useful in a revitalization context where, let's say, you're from Kauai, you're in a classroom on Oahu learning standardized revitalized Hawaiian, but you're doing it in order to maintain a link to your ancestral past. There are many students who are interested in revitalizing the form of the language that their ancestors spoke. So being able to go into this archive, hear their own ancestors, hear people from the place that they are from, and then be able to actually target those voices to imitate and to learn, I think is a really valuable thing for Indigenous identity in this community. We also have the ability in this app to click on individual sounds and hear them. So we can listen to the original sound that is creating these either dots for monophthongs or these trajectories for the diphthongs, and we can make this sort of connection of the visual and the auditory to increase learner engagement. So this is something I've been developing that I hope is going to be useful in the future. And here are some of the people who have been also doing work in this space. So on the right is Lisa Davidson. I've been doing work with her that measures and describes the acoustic correlates of stress in Hawaiian among the Old Native speakers. And we found, for instance, that pitch and intensity are correlates of stress, but not duration. And Oivi, who's the second to right there, Oivi and Lisa have been publishing together on VOT and glottalization in these Old Native speakers. They've been starting to do some new data collection among L1 and L2 speakers on the island of Hawaii, so immersion speakers and L2 speakers. On the left here, we have Andrew Chung and Ha'alileo Solomon from University of Hawaii at Manoa. They've also been doing similar research, doing recordings of learners and immersion school students on Oahu. And all five of us together in March are going to be running a 3-day workshop where we are at the conference on language documentation and conservation in Honolulu, where we're trying to build rapport with community members to sort of basically demystify what linguistics is to learners of Hawaiian and people involved in the revitalization, and also have them tell us what are your priorities, right? Like what things are interesting to you that we should be looking at? Is it TK stuff? Is it vowel stuff? Is it glottalization stuff? Like what are your pet peeves as teachers? What are the things that challenge you as students? What are the ways that you would like to sort of become closer with the lects, the dialects that are meaningful to you, so that we as linguists aren't just sort of doing our own things that are interesting to us as theory, but things that are also of interest and of use to the community for pedagogical purposes and for sort of language revitalization purposes. So mahalo, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we have a couple minutes